24th of May, 1941. The fabric wings of Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond's ferry Swordfish trembled violently as he pushed the biplane through storm-laden clouds above the Denmark Strait. Behind him, the most powerful battleship ever built by Nazi Germany had just sent Britain's pride, HMS Hood, to the bottom of the Atlantic in less than 8 minutes. 3 magazines had exploded. Over 1,400 men died before most could even comprehend what was happening. The Bismarck, all 41,000 tons of German engineering superiority, was now steaming toward the open ocean, where she would tear apart the convoys keeping Britain alive. The British Admiralty knew they had perhaps 72 hours before this Leviathan disappeared into the vastness of the Atlantic. Every available ship was ordered to pursue. The fate of the war itself seemed to hang on stopping this single vessel. But the weapon they would ultimately deploy against this modern marvel was something the Germans had openly mocked since the war began. A biplane so obsolete it looked like it had escaped from the Great War. The ferry Swordfish, affectionately called the string bag by its crews, had a maximum speed of barely 138 miles per hour. Its fuselage was covered not with metal, but with fabric. Canvas stretched over a metal frame like something from the era of the Red Baron. German Messerschmitt fighters were nearly 3 times faster. Bismarck's anti-aircraft gunners had trained against targets moving at modern speeds, expecting sleek monoplanes that dove at 300 miles per hour. The Swordfish was a dinosaur. Everyone knew it. German intelligence reports dismissed it as barely worthy of concern. Kriegsmarine officers had reviewed footage of these biplanes and actually laughed at British backwardness. How could a nation that once ruled the waves now be reduced to sending fabric-covered antiques into battle against the finest ships German industry could produce? Yet there was something these confident officers didn't understand. The Swordfish's very obsolescence had become its secret weapon. Its slow speed meant it could launch torpedoes at exceptionally close range with devastating accuracy. Its fabric construction made it nearly invisible to the primitive radar of the era. The metal frame wasn't dense enough to return a strong signal, and the canvas simply absorbed radar waves. And perhaps most importantly, its open cockpit meant the pilot could actually see and feel everything happening around him, could sense the wind and waves in ways that pilots cocooned in enclosed cockpits never could. According to official Royal Navy records maintained at the National Archives in Kew, the Swordfish had already proven itself more capable than anyone expected. In November of 1940, these same obsolete biplanes had struck the Italian fleet at Taranto, crippling 3 battleships in a single night raid. That attack had been studied intensely by Japanese naval planners, who would use its lessons at Pearl Harbor just over a year later. But Taranto had been against ships at anchor in a harbor. The Bismarck was different, a moving fortress with the finest anti-aircraft systems Germany possessed, commanded by one of their most capable admirals, steaming at high speed through the North Atlantic. Stopping her would require not just courage but a kind of aerial assassination, a perfect strike at exactly the right moment against exactly the right spot. 21st of May, 1941. 3 days before Lieutenant Commander Esmond would face the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, the great ship slipped her moorings at Gotenhafen in occupied Poland. Admiral Günther Lütjens stood on the bridge, a grim man bearing the weight of Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise. His orders were elegant in their brutality: break into the Atlantic shipping lanes and destroy everything flying the British flag. The Bismarck was not sailing alone. Accompanying her was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and together they represented the most powerful surface raiding force Germany had yet unleashed. The Bismarck's 8 15-inch guns could punch through the armor of any ship afloat at ranges exceeding 20 miles. Her belt armor was over 12 inches thick. Her crew of over 2,000 men had trained relentlessly. They believed, with good reason, that their ship was unsinkable. British naval intelligence had been tracking German naval movements through a network of Norwegian resistance fighters, ultra-decryption intercepts, and photographic reconnaissance. When reconnaissance Spitfires confirmed the Bismarck had departed, the Admiralty went to full alert. First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound knew exactly what was at stake. Britain was an island under siege. Every ounce of food, fuel, and ammunition came by sea. If the Bismarck reached the convoy routes, the carnage would be catastrophic. The Royal Navy deployed everything available. From Scapa Flow came HMS Hood and the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. From other stations came cruisers, HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk, to shadow the German force. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the home fleet, set sail in HMS King George V with a battle group that included the aircraft carrier, HMS Victorious. Every captain understood the stakes. Every sailor knew they were hunting history's most dangerous warship. The initial contact came on the 23rd of May when HMS Suffolk, equipped with the latest radar, picked up the German ships in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. The cruiser shadowed through fog and sleet, maintaining contact while transmitting position reports. Throughout that night, the British forces converged. The Hood and Prince of Wales raced northwest at maximum speed. Their crews grabbed what sleep they could, knowing battle was inevitable. Dawn on the 24th of May brought clear skies and calm seas, perfect conditions for a gunnery duel. At 5:52 in the morning, lookouts on HMS Hood spotted the German ships at a range of 17 miles. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding from Hood, immediately ordered his ships to turn toward the enemy and open fire. What happened next would traumatize the Royal Navy for generations. The Hood was the pride of the fleet, the largest warship in the world when commissioned, a ship that had shown the flag in every corner of the British Empire. But she was also old, her deck armor inadequate by modern standards. At 5:55, as the range closed to just under 12 miles, the Bismarck's fifth salvo struck home. The shells penetrated Hood's deck and found her aft magazines. The explosion was so massive that Prince of Wales, following behind, had to steer hard to avoid the debris raining from the sky. When the smoke cleared, Hood had been broken in half. Her bow section rose almost vertically from the water before sliding beneath the waves. Of 1,419 men aboard, exactly 3 survived. The Prince of Wales fought on alone, exchanging salvos with both German ships. But she was brand new, her gun crews still working out mechanical problems, civilian contractors still aboard completing installations. After taking several hits, her captain broke off the engagement. The Bismarck, seemingly invincible, continued toward the Atlantic. She had been hit 3 times by Prince of Wales, one shell flooding a fuel tank and contaminating others, but these seemed minor annoyances. At the Admiralty in London, the news of Hood's destruction struck like a physical blow. Winston Churchill himself demanded action. Every available ship was ordered to pursue. The Bismarck had to be stopped. 24th of May, 1941, early afternoon. Aboard HMS Victorious, the newest aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond briefed his strike force. 9 ferry Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron would attack the Bismarck that evening. The carrier had only recently been commissioned, many of her crew barely trained. The Swordfish crews had never worked together as a unit before. Most had never attacked a capital ship under combat conditions. But the Admiralty was desperate. Hood was gone. Prince of Wales was damaged. If Bismarck escaped, the consequences were unthinkable. Esmond was 32 years old, a career naval aviator with a reputation for absolute competence. His crews trusted him completely. As he explained the attack plan, he kept his voice steady and matter-of-fact, though everyone in the ready room understood they were being asked to do something nearly suicidal. They would fly through whatever weather they encountered, locate a moving battleship in the North Atlantic, approach through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and drop their Mark 12 torpedoes from close range. The Bismarck's guns could throw up a curtain of steel that should, by all reasonable calculation, obliterate fabric-covered biplanes. But Esmond had studied Taranto. He understood that the Swordfish's slowness was actually an advantage against gunnery systems designed for faster targets. Anti-aircraft predictors and directors expected targets at modern speeds. When the Swordfish came in at barely 100 miles per hour, the German gunners would constantly overshoot, their training working against them. At 2200 hours, with the sun still providing twilight in the northern latitude, the Swordfish lumbered off Victorious's deck. Each carried an 1,800-pound torpedo and a crew of 3, pilot, observer, and air gunner. The obsolete biplanes formed up and headed toward the last known position of the Bismarck, guided by reports from the shadowing cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk. Flying through deteriorating weather, Esmond led his formation on a sweep that finally located the Bismarck at 2300 hours. The great ship was still making high speed, her wake bright in the dim light. As the Swordfish began their attack run, the Bismarck's anti-aircraft batteries erupted. The sky filled with tracer fire, the heavy guns throwing up patterns of bursting shells that created walls of shrapnel. Esmond took his division in from the port side, while the other aircraft attacked from starboard, attempting to split the defensive fire. The noise was incredible. The roar of engines, the crash of anti-aircraft fire, the shouts of crew members calling out positions and threats. The Swordfish bounced and shuddered through the turbulence created by exploding shells. Fabric tore in places, struts were hit, but the biplanes kept coming. At just under 1,000 yards, flying barely above the wave tops, the Swordfish released their torpedoes. The heavy weapons dropped into the water, their contra-rotating propellers spinning up as they ran toward the Bismarck at 40 knots. The biplanes pulled away hard, jinking through the anti-aircraft fire, some so close to the battleship that gunners couldn't depress their weapons low enough to track them. One torpedo struck. The explosion sent a column of water higher than Bismarck's bridge, but the battleship's armor held. The damage was superficial, barely slowing the ship. As the Swordfish flew back toward Victorious, Esmond knew they had failed to stop her. But they had proven something important. The obsolete biplanes could reach the Bismarck, they could survive her defenses. And if they had another chance with better conditions and more aircraft, they might just accomplish what seemed impossible. All 9 Swordfish returned safely to Victorious, a minor miracle given what they'd flown through. But the Bismarck was still steaming toward the Atlantic, still dangerous, still apparently unstoppable. 25th of May, 1941. Admiral Gunther Lütjens faced a decision that would determine not only his fate, but potentially the outcome of the entire Atlantic campaign. The Bismarck had shaken off her pursuers during the night, her speed and course changes allowing her to slip away from the radar-equipped cruisers that had been shadowing her since the Denmark Strait. For precious hours, the British had lost contact with the most wanted ship in the world, but Lütjens knew his situation was deteriorating. The hit from HMS Prince of Wales had contaminated fuel tanks, reducing his range. The Bismarck was trailing oil, leaving a telltale slick on the water. More critically, the entire Royal Navy was now hunting him. Every available battleship, cruiser, and destroyer was steaming toward potential intercept positions. The carrier HMS Ark Royal was coming up from Gibraltar with Force H, bringing more Swordfish and more torpedoes. The Admiral made a fateful choice. Instead of continuing toward the French Atlantic ports as originally planned, he would make for Brest on the French coast, where Bismarck could be repaired and protected by land-based Luftwaffe fighters. He transmitted his intentions in a long radio message to Naval Group West. It was a necessary communication, but also a critical mistake. British listening stations picked up the transmission. While they couldn't immediately decrypt the message, they could triangulate its source. By mid-morning of the 25th, British naval intelligence had a rough position. But rough wasn't good enough in the vast North Atlantic. Admiral Tovey in HMS King George V was steaming hard, but wasn't certain he was heading in the right direction. Fuel was becoming critical for many British ships. If they didn't find the Bismarck soon, they would have to break off the pursuit. At 10:30 hours, a consolidated Catalina flying boat of Coastal Command, flown by Flying Officer Dennis Briggs with American co-pilot Ensign Leonard Smith of the United States Navy, spotted the Bismarck through a break in the clouds. The sighting report crackled across the airways. The German battleship was much farther south than expected, steaming southeast toward France. Tovey immediately adjusted course, but his plotting officers delivered grim news. King George V and HMS Rodney, the 2 British battleships in pursuit, would barely have enough fuel to reach the Bismarck before she came under the protection of German air cover. Everything now depended on slowing the Bismarck down, and the only force in position to do that was Force H from Gibraltar, specifically the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal with her Swordfish squadrons. Vice Admiral James Somerville, commanding Force H, pushed his ships to maximum speed, racing north to get into striking range. Aboard Ark Royal, aircrews prepared their ancient biplanes for what they knew would be the most important mission of their lives. The ship's squadrons, 810, 818, and 820 Naval Air Squadrons, had some of the most experienced swordfish crews in the Fleet Air Arm. Many had flown combat missions in the Mediterranean. They understood both the capabilities and limitations of their aircraft. They also understood that if they failed, the Bismarck would escape. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. The North Atlantic was living up to its fearsome reputation, with towering waves, driving rain, and clouds down to wave level. These were conditions that would ground modern aircraft. But the Swordfish had been designed for exactly these situations. Its robust structure could handle turbulence that would tear apart more sophisticated planes. Its crew, sitting in open cockpits, could maintain visual contact with the water and with each other, even when instruments became unreliable. As the afternoon wore on, Ark Royal closed to within striking distance. The carrier's deck crews began spotting Swordfish for launch, loading torpedoes, running up engines. Down in the ready rooms, pilots and observers studied recognition photographs of the Bismarck, memorizing her silhouette, the positions of her anti-aircraft batteries, her vulnerable points. They knew that Hood's crew had died in minutes. They knew that Bismarck had already survived one torpedo attack. But they also knew that the fate of the Atlantic convoy routes, perhaps the fate of Britain itself, rested on their obsolete biplanes and their Mark 12 torpedoes. 26th of May, 1941, 1450 hours. The first strike of 15 Swordfish launched from HMS Ark Royal into weather so violent that maintaining formation was almost impossible. Rain lashed the fabric wings. Wind buffeted the slow biplanes mercilessly. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The crews flew on instruments and faith, heading toward the position where the Bismarck should be. 30 minutes into the flight, the observer in the lead aircraft spotted a ship through the murk, a large warship, making high speed, leaving a massive wake. The silhouette matched their recognition briefing. At 15:20 hours, the Swordfish began their attack run, dropping to torpedo launching altitude, splitting into divisions to attack from multiple directions. The ship below erupted in anti-aircraft fire. But something seemed wrong. The volume of fire was less than expected. The ship's profile, seen close up, didn't quite match. In the confusion of weather and combat, the Swordfish crews had found not the Bismarck, but HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been detached from Force H to shadow the German battleship. 11 torpedoes splashed into the water, running toward a British ship. The Sheffield's captain, realizing instantly what was happening, threw his ship into violent evasive maneuvers. The cruiser's superior speed and the Mark 12 torpedoes' notorious unreliability saved the day. Most of the torpedoes' magnetic pistols detonated prematurely, exploding on contact with the heavy seas. Others ran wild. Not a single one struck Sheffield. The returning Swordfish crews were devastated. They had nearly killed hundreds of their own sailors. The magnetic pistol detonators, which had seemed so promising in trials, had proven catastrophically unreliable in actual combat conditions. For the second strike, scheduled to launch in just a few hours, the torpedoes would be fitted with old-fashioned contact pistols. They would have to actually hit the Bismarck's hull to detonate. Aboard Ark Royal, the mood was grim. They had one more chance. Daylight was fading. The Bismarck was getting closer to French air cover with every passing minute. The British battleships were racing to intercept, but might not arrive in time. Everything depended on the next strike succeeding where the first had nearly caused disaster. At 19:10 hours, 15 Swordfish from 81, 0818, and 820 squadrons launched into the gathering darkness. Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode led the strike. His crews knew this was likely their last opportunity. After this, either the Bismarck would be crippled or she would escape. There would be no third chance. The Swordfish flew through conditions that were, if anything, worse than the first strike. The weather had deteriorated further. Waves were cresting at 40 feet. Rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. But Sheffield was now shadowing the Bismarck and radiating homing signals that the Swordfish navigators could follow. The obsolete biplanes pressed on through the storm. At 20:47 hours, they found her. Through driving rain and failing light, the Bismarck appeared like a steel mountain rising from the tortured sea. Admiral Lutyens had been pushing his ship at maximum speed all day, confident that he would soon be under the protection of German air cover. His anti-aircraft crews were exhausted from constant alerts, but they had beaten off one Swordfish attack already. They were confident they could do it again. The Swordfish split into subflights, attacking from different directions to divide the defensive fire. The battleship's guns opened up, filling the air with tracer rounds and exploding shells. But the conditions that made flying so difficult also made gunnery almost impossible. The pitching deck, the poor visibility, the slow-moving targets that appeared and disappeared in the murk. Everything worked against the German gunners. Lieutenant Commander Coode took his division in from the starboard quarter, the aircraft bouncing through turbulence and flak bursts. Sub-Lieutenant Henry Beale's observer, Lieutenant Michael Percy, fixed his eyes on the Bismarck's stern, calculating the deflection angle, the torpedo run, the ship's speed and heading. At just under 900 yards, Beale released his torpedo and hauled the Swordfish away in a hard climbing turn. The Mark 12 torpedo, fitted with a simple contact pistol, ran true through the heavy seas. At 20:49 hours, it struck the Bismarck's stern, just forward of the rudder. 26th of May, 1941, 20:49 hours. The explosion from Sub-Lieutenant Beale's torpedo sent a shudder through the Bismarck's entire 41,000-ton hull. Down in the steering compartments far aft in the ship, sailors were thrown off their feet. Electrical systems sparked and failed. The compartments began flooding. Within minutes, Bismarck's damage control teams discovered a catastrophic problem. The torpedo had struck in the worst possible location. It had jammed the ship's twin rudders 12 degrees to port. All attempts to move them failed. The hydraulic systems were destroyed. The rudders were locked in position, and without them, the Bismarck could not maintain a straight course. Despite her 4 massive propellers and powerful engines, the battleship was forced to steam in a wide circle, heading northwest, directly back toward the British home fleet that was racing to intercept her. Admiral Lutyens understood immediately that his ship was doomed. He had been confident, even optimistic, that they would reach the French coast by morning. Now, crippled by a single torpedo from an obsolete biplane, the Bismarck was steaming helplessly toward the very forces she had been trying to escape. The Admiral transmitted a final message to Naval Group West. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." Throughout the night of the 26th to 27th of May, the Bismarck's crew worked desperately to regain steering control. Divers went over the side in mountainous seas, trying to reach the rudders with cutting equipment. Engineers attempted to rig an emergency steering system using the propellers alone. Nothing worked. The ship continued her helpless circle through the Atlantic darkness while British destroyers closed in, harrying her with torpedo attacks, preventing her crew from any rest. Admiral Tovey and HMS King George V had received the report of the torpedo hit with barely suppressed relief. His battleships were running desperately low on fuel, and he had been calculating whether he would have to break off the pursuit. Now the Bismarck was coming to him. Throughout the night, Tovey positioned his forces for a dawn engagement. King George V and HMS Rodney would approach from the northwest. The battleship Ramillies, though slower, was closing from the south. Heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire were shadowing from a distance. The Bismarck was trapped. The German crew, realizing their fate, prepared for their final battle. They had ammunition. Their main guns still worked perfectly. Their armor was intact except for the stern damage. They would die, certainly, but they would die fighting. Throughout the night, they destroyed secret equipment, burned codebooks, prepared demolition charges in case they needed to scuttle. Many wrote final letters home, though they knew the letters would never be delivered. Others simply tried to rest before the dawn battle. Aboard the British ships, the mood was grimly determined. The Hood had to be avenged. The Bismarck had to be sunk. After the shock of Hood's destruction, the Royal Navy needed a decisive victory. But there was also a professional respect for their opponent. The German ship had fought magnificently. Her crew had proven skillful and courageous. The coming battle would be brutal, but necessary. As dawn broke on the 27th of May, the seas were still running high, though visibility had improved slightly. At 08:43 hours, HMS Rodney's lookout spotted the Bismarck, still circling slowly, unable to escape or maneuver. Admiral Tovey gave the order to open fire. At 08:47, from a range of over 12 miles, Rodney's 16-inch guns roared. The final battle of the Bismarck had begun. and it had become possible only because a single torpedo from an obsolete biplane had struck precisely the right spot at precisely the right moment, a shot that would change the course of the Atlantic campaign and vindicate the despised Stringbag as one of the most effective torpedo bombers of the entire war. Historical records maintained by the British National Archives confirmed that of the 15 swordfish that attacked on the evening of the 26th of May, only 2 were lost, one to anti-aircraft fire and one that ditched on return to Ark Royal when it ran out of fuel. The obsolete biplanes had accomplished what the Hood and Prince of Wales could not. They had crippled the Bismarck. 27th of May, 1941, 08:47 hours. The dawn sky over the North Atlantic exploded in flame and thunder as HMS Rodney's 9 16-inch guns fired their first salvo at the crippled Bismarck. Within minutes, HMS King George V added her 10 14-inch guns to the bombardment. The 2 British battleships had positioned themselves at optimal range, their fire control systems calculating solutions against a target that could barely maneuver. The Bismarck's crew responded immediately, her forward turrets swinging toward the British ships, her 8 15-inch guns returning fire. For a few minutes, it seemed the German battleship might still prove herself the superior vessel. Her third salvo straddled Rodney, sending columns of water higher than the British ship's masts. But the Bismarck was fighting at a crippling disadvantage. Unable to steer except in slow circles, she could not dodge or choose her range. She was simply a target, however heavily armored. At 08:59, barely 12 minutes into the battle, a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward superstructure. The shell penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, destroying the forward fire control director and killing most of the officers on the bridge. Admiral Lutyens died in this explosion, though his body would never be identified. The Bismarck's ability to aim her main guns accurately was severely degraded. More shells struck home. One after another, the British battleships pounded the German ship from both sides. Heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire joined in, their 8-inch guns adding to the deluge of steel. The heavy cruiser Dorsetshire would eventually fire over 300 shells at the Bismarck without pause. The range closed steadily as the British ships grew more confident, eventually coming to within 2 miles, point-blank range for battleships. By 09:30, barely 45 minutes into the battle, Bismarck had been reduced to a burning wreck. Her main turrets had fallen silent, either destroyed or with their crews dead. Her superstructure was a twisted ruin. Fires raged throughout the ship. Yet still she floated, her massive hull refusing to sink, her underwater protection holding despite multiple torpedo hits from the shadowing cruisers and destroyers that had continued attacking throughout the night. The British ships continued firing. Admiral Tovey was determined that the Bismarck would not escape, would not survive to threaten another convoy. The bombardment continued methodically, brutally. Observers on the British ships later reported that they ceased to think of the Bismarck as a ship and saw her simply as a structure to be demolished. The one-sided battle had become an execution. By 10:15 hours, Admiral Tovey faced a critical decision. His battleships were running dangerously low on fuel. German aircraft and U-boats would soon be arriving from France. He had to break off the engagement and head for port. But the Bismarck, though completely destroyed above the waterline, was still afloat. Her hull integrity was remarkable. Tovey ordered HMS Dorsetshire to finish her with torpedoes. The cruiser closed to point-blank range and fired 3 torpedoes. At least 2 struck home. At 10:36 hours, the Bismarck began listing heavily to port. Her crew, those who still survived, began abandoning ship. Many were already setting scuttling charges below decks, determined that if their ship had to die, she would die by German hands, not British. At 10:39 hours, the Bismarck rolled completely over and sank by the stern. She went down in over 15,000 feet of water, approximately 400 miles west of Brest. Of her crew of 2,206 men, only 115 survived to be picked up by HMS Dorsetshire and the destroyer HMS Maori, before reports of U-boat contacts forced the British ships to abandon the rescue effort. The news reached London by early afternoon. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons later that day, announced, "The Bismarck is sunk." The chamber erupted in cheers. The shock of Hood's loss had been avenged. The threat to the Atlantic lifeline had been eliminated. British morale, badly shaken by years of defeats and setbacks, received a tremendous boost. But among the Fleet Air Arm pilots, particularly the Swordfish crews, there was quiet satisfaction rather than celebration. They had proven that their obsolete biplanes could accomplish what battleships and cruisers could not. They had struck the blow that made everything else possible. The sinking of the Bismarck on the 27th of May, 1941, marked a turning point, not just in the Battle of the Atlantic, but in naval warfare itself. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers and their torpedo bombers had become the decisive weapons in modern naval combat. Battleships, for all their guns and armor, were vulnerable to air attack, and the aircraft that had proven this truth was the slowest, most obsolete-looking warplane in any Navy's inventory. The ferry Swordfish would continue flying combat missions until the very end of the war in Europe. These fabric-covered biplanes sank more enemy ships than any other Allied torpedo bomber. They flew anti-submarine patrols, mine-laying missions, and reconnaissance flights in conditions that grounded more modern aircraft. In February of 1942, 6 Swordfish, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, the same officer who had led the first strike against the Bismarck, attacked the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during their famous channel dash up the English Channel. All 6 Swordfish were shot down. Esmond was killed. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. The Swordfish's success against the Bismarck validated several important principles that modern military forces still study. First, obsolescence is not always a disadvantage. In certain situations, older technology can be more effective than newer designs. The Swordfish's slow speed, which seemed like a fatal flaw, made it nearly impossible for modern fire control systems to track effectively. Its fabric construction actually helped it survive anti-aircraft fire. Shells often passed through the canvas without detonating, leaving holes that barely affected the aircraft's flying characteristics. Second, crew training and determination matter more than hardware specifications. The Swordfish crews who attacked the Bismarck were professionals who understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations. They flew through conditions that would have turned back less determined aviators. They pressed their attacks into heavy anti-aircraft fire, knowing that one mistake would be fatal. Their skill and courage made the critical difference. Third, even the most powerful weapon systems have vulnerabilities. The Bismarck was the finest battleship German engineering could produce, but a single torpedo, striking her rudder, rendered all that power useless. Modern military planners call this catastrophic single-point failure, when damage to one seemingly minor system cascades into total mission failure. The Bismarck's designers had protected her magazines, her engines, her gun turrets, but they hadn't anticipated that immobilizing her steering would be just as fatal as any of these. The Germans learned their lesson from the Bismarck's loss. Hitler, furious at the sinking, essentially abandoned surface ship operations in the Atlantic. German capital ships spent the rest of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, becoming what Churchill called ships in being, threats that tied down British resources without actually engaging. The Kriegsmarine shifted its focus entirely to U-boats, which would come terrifyingly close to severing Britain's Atlantic lifeline before being defeated by improved anti-submarine warfare tactics. For the British, the Bismarck's destruction came at a critical moment. In May of 1941, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union had not yet been invaded. The United States had not yet entered the war. British cities were being bombed nightly. Rommel was advancing in North Africa. Greece and Crete had fallen. The sinking of the Bismarck provided proof that Britain could still strike back effectively. That German power was not invincible. The ferry Swordfish was finally retired from frontline service in May of 1945, having outlasted many of the modern aircraft that were supposed to replace it. Total production was 2392 aircraft. They served on battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. They flew from land bases and from merchant ships converted into escort carriers. And throughout their service, they remained fabric-covered biplanes that looked like they belonged in the Great War, not the Second World War. Today, only a handful of Swordfish remain, carefully preserved in museums. But their legacy lives on in naval aviation doctrine worldwide. They proved that technological superiority isn't always decisive, that courage and skill can overcome apparent disadvantages, and that sometimes the weapon everyone laughs at turns out to be exactly what wins the battle. The Germans had indeed laughed at Britain's outdated biplanes, but the Swordfish crews had the last laugh when one torpedo from their obsolete aircraft sent the mighty Bismarck steaming helplessly toward her doom.